Hello and welcome to another Bazaar guide. It's been a long time coming, but it's finally time for us to cover the last hero currently in the game, in other words, Dooley. Of course, Stelle is on the horizon as well, and when she drops, I'm naturally planning to make an overview for her as well. But today's agenda is our little robot friend. As per usual, if you've seen any of my other overviews, you'll be familiar with the general concept, but this is meant to be more broad, talking about kind of what is it that Dooley is and does, so that you can familiarize yourself a bit with the character. I think there's something for everyone here, even if you've played a lot of him already, or if you are more looking to get into playing him, but in any case, it's more broad. I do actually think Dooley is in a very good spot currently, and I've been playing him a ton myself, so I might also make a more specific strategy guide that's more tied to the current meta sometime in the near future. But as of right now, overview time. And normally, if you've seen any of my other ones, then you know I like to just jump right into it. However, Dooley is different when it comes to this. The first thing that I just have to cover in order for any of it to make sense is the cores. This is a mechanic that is unique to Dooley. Every time he hits level 3 in a run, currently that always happens on day 2 unless you've lost one of the first 2 PvE encounters, you will get a pick of 5 of 7 cores, and that'll be your core for the run. You also get a guaranteed upgrade for them, currently at level 7, but the general gist is every run, Dooley has a core. The cores will be in the overview, but if I only talk about them as if they were normal items, it just wouldn't make a lot of sense. So I'm going to briefly go over the different cores. I've kind of grouped them up here to make it a little bit easier based on how they activate. And we're starting off with the core. It's sort of the base core, you could see it as. It has the typical activation scheme of when an item to the left is used, it charges the core, and then the core does something to the items on the right. In the case of the regular core, it is also one of the 3 red cores, as we usually call them, which are the ones that deal damage. Now, Primal core technically is that too. It's the latest edition. It functions a little bit differently from those. So when someone says that they're playing a red core strategy, it's usually referring to the core, the crit core, or the weaponized core. But that's getting ahead of myself. The core deals damage and charges the items to the right by 1 second. So items to the left charge the core so that the core charges items to the right. The following 3 here that I've categorized as positionally scaling, they do the same thing. They charge when you use any item on the left, and they scale any item on the right. Currently, they also scale themselves, and from left to right, we have the armored core, which shields and scales shield items, the ignition core, which burns and scales burn items, and the weaponized core, which deals damage and scales damage items. Then we have the non-positional cores that care about what item is being activated rather than where. The companion core wants you to activate friends anywhere, and the primal core wants you to activate relics or dinosaurs anywhere. And the companion core hastes items adjacent to it, so it's not entirely non-positional, whereas the primal core is entirely non-positional because it will then scale all relics and dinosaurs, but it turns adjacent items into relics as well. Nonetheless, I've classified them like this because these activate when you meet a certain criteria rather than just use items to the left. And then finally we have the crit core because it's kind of both. It will both charge when you use any item to the left or when any of your items crit. So it has 2 different ways of charging, and it's also the only core that default can charge itself. and then it gives crit chance to all items on its right, but it's a passive buff that doesn't scale or change in any way during the course of a fight. So it's a bit of a unique one in that sense. But this will make more sense when I go over the whole overview. At least you will understand what I'm talking about when I point to a core and say, like, the armored core goes in the shield category. However, of course, it wouldn't be so simple as to that being the only thing that's weird about Dooley. He's also a character that's very focused on acceleration as a concept. He both cares about having fast items, playing stuff like Uzi, playing neutral items like Fang, playing Vanessa items like Clamra, things that go off quick or at the start of combat. He loves those, and then he can use them to accelerate other things. He can use the core to accelerate whatever you want. Fiber optics, he can use a battery to accelerate things. This will be in the overview, but this is good to cover preemptively, together with the fact that Dooley also cares a lot about disruption. He has a lot of slow, he has a lot of freeze, and because his builds are largely about making things go off quickly and having things that are quick, rather than usually caring about specific tags like you'd see on Aquatic Vanessa. And there are some exceptions even to this, but that's entirely for the overview. It just means that Dooley is and always has and always will be, to some degree, a character that is centered around disrupting enemy strategies, because when you're very flexible in what you're doing with your board, you have the flexibility to choose to disrupt your opponent's game plan, which is, of course, very generically powerful. The final thing, and the reason why I had to do this whole preamble for the overview to actually make sense, is because Dooley does have some archetypes, but he doesn't have strict archetypes the same way that, say, Vanessa does. When Vanessa is playing a weapons board, you can say that's weapons Vanessa. When you're playing a slow Vanessa, you'll go that's slow Vanessa. When you're playing aquatic Vanessa, you'll go that's aquatic Vanessa. But when you're talking about Dooley strategies, you're more focused on what it is trying to accomplish generally. When you're talking about a power drill strategy, which we'll get to those in the overview, it doesn't really make much sense in terms of just, oh, okay, so they've got a power drill on the board. What's the rest? Instead, Dooley's builds are more like directions that you spec into. Depending on which core you chose at level 3, depending on where you've put your upgrades, depending on which items you've hedged, you'll more move in the direction of a broader strategy, but it also just might be you're playing the core with whichever item is the most powerful to charge. You're playing fiber optics with just whichever item you happen to find that was the most powerful to charge. It's why Dooley is very known for loving having access to out-of-class items, items from the other heroes, items that Dooley can break to its heart's content. And that's why when we're going over this overview, it won't connect in the same way that it does for many other characters. You could liken Penft and Uzi to each other, but fundamentally on the character, they fill completely different roles between Dooley and Pygmalion, because on Dooley, the only thing you care about is that it's 2 seconds. It could just as well be a nesting doll, or when Lighter had a shorter cooldown, it could be Lighter. It doesn't matter. It can be a Fang. Whereas, of course, on Pygmalion, it has to be Penft, because you care about things other than just how fast the item is. So keep that in mind. But as per usual, I'll show you the overview now. This won't be a be-all, end-all overview either. Don't treat it as only the items that you can see or the items that are relevant or anything like that. there's a lot more to Dooley, but I picked this to kind of make it make sense, at least in terms of which directions you can take him. And as I mentioned, we have acceleration down here. That kind of goes into every Dooley build. You're never going to be doing something on Dooley where acceleration doesn't matter. Whichever core you picked, whichever item you're trying to make broken, whichever direction you're trying to spec yourself into, you will want some form of acceleration. And this both goes for small fast items, start of combat items, or things like the core, things like the fiber optics, things like the crude tools, things that make things faster go on every Dooley board. So treat that as kind of an underlying general rule for Dooley. He also does have one of these that I always classify as kind of modifiers. It's not really these two things, the flashy pilot or the saddles, that are the modifiers. They're just here to look better, but it's the thrusters that are the specific modifier that we're looking at in this case. It has the ability to turn anything into a vehicle. And because Flashy Pilot gives you crit when you use a vehicle, there's propane tank, there's command ship, or there's the saddle that makes a vehicle have multicast, it means that Dooley can generically designate any item in the game as now being a vehicle. And because of that, it can go in virtually any build. It just depends on, do you have a thing that you really badly want to give multicast to or not? So that one's kind of off there in the corner. I'll quickly go over the weaponized core too, because it doesn't really connect to anything else on this space. The weaponized core scales damage. It's good to pair with things for which it is powerful to scale their damage. I've highlighted some just neat ones. Proboscis is a bit harder to get a hold of these days, but since Dooley does have slow items like Plasma Grenade, if you get to scale the damage on the Proboscis, especially if it's paired with skills, you can make hilarious builds. Or there's just stuff like Flamethrower, which turns its damage into burn. It's not as powerful now as it was when it had kind of quadratic scaling on that, where it would multiply the damage into burn, and then if you gave it crit, it would multiply it further and stuff like that. But it's still a very powerful strategy, since of course, if the numbers are equivalent, then burn is more powerful than damage. And you can run it as a standalone scaling carry core now that that's how the cores function. The ones that scale themselves as well. But that doesn't thematically connect directly to anything else on this whole board. But we can start in this top corner with the force field. That's another one that sometimes doesn't connect to anything bar the acceleration, of course, which is the cornerstone of the force field OTK type builds, where you have a defense grid or something that gives you a large chunk of shield, and then you're trying to just kill them with one activation. But it lets you convert shield into damage, and sometimes it's been a strategy with stuff like the armored core and the duct tape that lets you scale up the shielding the duct tape gives and the shielding that the force field gives, turning into kind of a scaling comp. You also have stuff like the bunker, which gives a multicast to shield items, that do mean that Dooley, at least thematically in his kit, has shield payoffs. However, due to the current state of the armored core, these aren't very popular, but they're still good to be aware of them existing. In the past, they have been very strong. If we get new, better shield items, or even an armored core rework, there is nothing to say that they couldn't be again. Then from the shield stuff, we can kind of bridge our way into Armadillo, which is a shield friend, because we do have distinct friend synergies with Dooley, and if you were playing a Armadillo carry comp, and now those days are long gone at present, but who knows, maybe Armadillo makes a comeback, it means that you can pair it with things like the robotics factory that gives multicast to friends. If you have a very powerful armadillo, you give it multicast. That's generally a recipe for success. Again, it's mostly just to illustrate the ways that you can have these directions connect a little bit, but normally Dooley doesn't move as freely between things as, for example, Vanessa would. But I did mention another one that does have a sort of strict archetype with actual payoffs is the friend stuff. Well, you'll notice as we go, but it's kind of a little bit divided into these are sort of the things that have stricter archetypes, whereas we've got the stuff that work a little bit more generically over here, but it was hard to make a super exact split, so hopefully it just at least gives you a proper idea of some of the stuff that Dooley does. But speaking of friends, we do have all of the dinosaurs are friends. This means that there's a natural overlap between anything that is a friend payoff and the dinosaurs. If you're running a dinosaur build and you put Robotics Factory on your board, congratulations, your dinosaurs have multicast. That is obviously a strong thing to do. We even have some stuff like Rex Specs, which also scales not just off of you using dinosaurs, but you using any friends. And I think this is kind of the developer's attempt to at least give Dooley a little bit more mobility. It means that in theory, even if you selected the Primal core as your core, you might have an out to transition more into a friend build. When the bugs were very popular, you'd run stuff like Dualtron, you'd see Robotics Factory at Gold, you'd see the friend archetype pretty much every run. Right now, it's less popular, but it's still good to be familiar with because you never know when that could change. It just depends on which synergies Dooley has available. The Primal Core is one that right now you mostly just pick this if you're playing dinosaurs. It also works with relics. There just aren't that many relics, so realistically, you're picking this because you want to play dinosaurs. Dino Sawyer is another powerful vehicle. It's a very fast activator. It can be a carry even when you're not playing kind of the destroy dinosaur archetype. But then you do need something that gives it the damage if it's not the destroy dinosaurs, or something that it uses the trigger for. If you have saddle to give it multicast and then a pendulum to accelerate something, those are very typical Dooley shenanigans to get up to. But in terms of the most, let's say, iconic dinosaur strategy, it's definitely these destroy dinosaurs, where the whole focus is that you go around chomping up your opponent's items, that scales all of your dinosaurs. That's pretty much the comp. And the destroy dinosaurs have some natural overlap with the crit core. The crit core is one of Dooley's, I would say, two cores that offer specific late game scaling. Obviously, having acceleration from the core can achieve a similar effect in terms of breaking something in the late game, but just having a generic, this is kind of like Vanessa's amulet if it was a medium item that was a bit weirder instead. But especially now that Vanessa's amulet has gotten really nerfed, suddenly the crit core doesn't look half bad by comparison. This one you oftentimes spec into, and this is what I've been talking about with how Dooley kind of specs into certain directions. If you know that you want more late game scaling, and you will use something like cybersecurity, Momasaur, Railgun, things that are fat stat sticks with a lot of flat damage but bad scaling, then scaling them with the crit core solves that issue. So those are typically the kind of things that you'll be adjacent to if you pick the crit core. Since it's also the only core that can scale it, that can charge itself, you can make some funny loops. If you 3D print crude tools to get it to 1 second, and you have it at max crit, then every time it goes off, it'll go off. These types of loops are also very iconic for Dooley. It's the thing that he's the most loved for and the most hated for. It just depends on how you feel about the little robot guy, if you think he's the greatest thing to ever happen to the game or just an outright menace. But he likes to loop things. Turns out that when your character is centered around acceleration and scaling, and you can make the accelerating things accelerate themselves, then that's kind of a good thing to be doing. The railgun specifically is also part of the tech archetype, which is more of a loose archetype. Some items care about you not having tech stuff, some items care about you having tech stuff. Sometimes you're just running stuff that happen to be tech stuff, but you don't really care about the tag. It's mainly for railgun that you would care about it because it charges when you use techs. If we loop back to the friends, I also consider the companion core to not be a generic friend thing. Funnily enough, when the bugs were popular, a lot of the time people would pick a better early game core, like the Ignition core was the most popular choice, even though all of the bugs were friends, because you were trying to play power drill, you were trying to play for tempo, you didn't really care for the haste. Because that's what the companion core really is all about. The fact that it gives targeted haste to adjacent targets means that the companion core is less so as good as its friends and more so as good as its haste payoffs. You can even play it with things like this thermal lance, which scale off of getting hasted and gains burn when you haste it. When thermal lance was especially powerful, some people would spec into the companion core just to have that angle open. But the most common things you'll see it paired with are things like Ballista or Monitor Lizard, because of course they are also friends themselves, so it creates a very natural synergy where the core will scale them up and make them faster, and then when they go off, they charge the core back, and you have a nice little loop. This category is just anything that gives haste, and of course, haste is also acceleration. So these categories are one and the same to a degree, but I still wanted to highlight it just because there are items like Bellolista, like Thermal Lance, that specifically scale off of haste. So a lot of the time, when you see a Dooley player start picking things up like Metronome, like GPU and motherboard back when that used to be a specific combo. Even now, if people are picking the companion core or you are picking up a motherboard because you want to scale something with haste, then that is a direction you can take Dooley in. More commonly right now, people tend to focus on the disruption package, kind of spearheaded by the plasma grenade, which is currently very, very strong, especially if you get any kind of slow duration boosts from Curio. But this also lets you play slow payoff items like Hamlet that charge off of your slows. You have the slow haste overlap in Pylon, which turns your slow procs into haste procs as well. You have some tech slow stuff like cool LEDs. At one point in time, this was pretty much considered the best item in the game. Nowadays, it's not nearly as impressive. It used to slow every time the core activated. Now it just charges by a second. But it can still be quite good, especially if you find skills like training from the B at the day 1 fight that lets you give damage to all of your weapons whenever you slow. If you find off-class items like Vanessa stuff that care about slow triggers, you have access to slow triggers. More generically, though, within Dooley's kit, it was especially used for power drill. Right now, it's nowhere near as common as it used to be, but it's another one of these that deserve a nod. I have missed an arrow here. I'll correct that in post for the version of this that you can find in the description. But of course, haste is also connected to this one. Poison would be, but we don't really have a poison Dooley archetype. The power drill just goes off whenever you Burn, poison, haste, slow, or freeze. It's the quintessential acceleration item because it takes in acceleration from all of these sources. And then usually you would either have something that scales it, maybe a skill like Shatter or that train that I mentioned, or a damage enchant, or you can use it itself to be acceleration for something that does the damage, like an ignition core, or have it with the regular core to charge a freeze item to just focus on the disruption and win that way. But that was always a common direction you would take Dooley in. And it is a great example of one of those boards where a drill board wasn't really anything specific. The drill board just meant that you played things that fulfilled the conditions to activate the drill. It was almost as if the drill kind of became your core. Sometimes people would even outright sell the core. Um, Back then, you had to transform the core to be able to sell it, but that was still something that people did for a while. And the general idea is that the cores do give you direction and let you spec in somewhere, but this is why I have to preface them a little bit, because they also don't necessarily stick around the whole run. And one of the most skill testing aspects of Dooley as a character is to know when you have to get out of your core or not. The ignition core was one of the most common pairings with the power drill, since of course the ignition core would charge the drill, unlike the just regular red cores, which don't charge it in any way. However, it was still pretty popular with the regular core, since then you would just use it to charge an item that did charge the drill, such as any of the free stuff. And this is kind of, we've reached the final corner on Dooley, and one of maybe his most overlooked parts of his kit, but that's still very quintessential to what has made the character so powerful anytime that he has been, which is the fact that freeze is the most powerful generic disruption outside of, straight up just killing the opponent. If their items are frozen, then they're not doing anything. And Dooley has historically been kind of the only character that has access to generic item-based freezes. Vanessa tends to have a lot of freeze skills oftentimes, and she has specific builds that freeze. Pygmalion is very similar. He has an entire freeze archetype, but when you're outside of that archetype, when you're not playing Freeze Pig, it's not like you can just chuck a freeze item on any pig board and be like, yeah, that looks good. But Dooley is different when it comes to that, because he's so focused on acceleration. If you're playing a tech build, then maybe you'll just play a tech freeze item. If you're playing a one-shot force field build, maybe you just want to slow the opposing first activation down with a freeze. Same thing if you're trying to one-shot with cybersecurity or Momasaur. If you're playing a weaponized core flamethrower scaling build, then maybe you want to freeze them to let your burn have the time it needs to tick. Freeze can go almost anywhere on Dooley, especially because he's so focused on acceleration, and we've seen time and time again that the thing that becomes the most broken when it is accelerated is freeze. It makes sense. If everything is frozen, then they can't really do anything. Of course, a lot of the time you can just accelerate something that kills the opponent too, but that's always much more contextually dependent on what you have to accelerate, whereas a good freeze item made faster will always be very powerful. We also do have some actual outright freeze synergy, like the Nitrogen Hammer, which charges and gains damage whenever you freeze. This is a very explicit freeze synergy. It's also most commonly the use case scenario for Kinetic Cannon, especially when paired with the regular core. You'll use small freeze items to disrupt the opponent. The Kinetic Cannon makes them charge the core, then the core makes them charge themselves, and that charges the Kinetic Cannon again, and then it deals the damage. It makes a lot of sense when you have a scaling and accelerating large carry item that takes care of the damage. You want to focus on the disruption and the acceleration. The best disruption is freeze. And finally, the last build that I'll mention is we also have the hydraulic press. It will destroy items after every combat, and then it takes the traits of the items that it's destroyed. It isn't really paired with any core because you make it the core by feeding it the core. And all you really need to pair with it is the remote control, which uses a core, and now you've made your hydraulic press a core, so then the press gets used oftentimes to just outright one-shot the opponent. You can easily give it multicast with the saddle because you can just turn it into a vehicle as well. You can give it multicast with the robotics factory because you can turn it into a friend. It can just be everything in the game all at once, and the reason why I've put that also adjacent to the free stuff is just to highlight. When you have a build that only really centrally requires 4 slots to be locked into this is what the build does, you have 6 slots worth of tech. This is one of the best builds in the game at being allowed to tech generically powerful things like freeze. And so this bottom quadrant here of the things that are adjacent to freeze, they will scale in power both, of course, based on how good the items themselves are. If the items are bad, you don't want to go in that direction, but also how powerful the freeze items are and how powerful freeze is in the meta. Whenever you start seeing a lot of big pig with double whammy, whenever you start seeing a lot of single weapon Vanessa that's really vulnerable to freeze's disruption, that's when these builds will just be at their peak. And I hope this kind of illustrates how Dooley is all about this. What you want to spec into, which direction you want to opt for. The core that you pick at level 3 has a profound impact on the entirety of how the rest of your run goes. If you choose to play for tempo with the early scaling core, if you choose to gain late game scaling with a specialized core, if you choose to go for a core that places you into a certain archetype, all of that is what makes these directions that you get to pick. But at the same time, because Dooley doesn't have those strict archetypes, even if you started with a weaponized core, if you just buy a bunch of freeze item, sell your core, and play the nitrogen hammer, you can just as well do that. And that's what I kind of wanted to highlight. That's the end of it all. That was my central point, is that it's best to think of Dooley as a variety of spread out directions that you get to opt into or specialize for, but you can't necessarily think of him as exactly like the other characters. Hopefully, this was at least somewhat helpful and cleared up. I think many people might find Dooley a bit hard to approach because of all of these differences, and it is a steep learning curve to get used to all of this. But when you do, he has a very fun and engaging tempo-centric playstyle. Of course, his stuff is very fast with a lot of activations. It can be a blast to play, at least depending on the meta. Right now, I sure think he is. And that'll be it for me. If you have any suggestions on specific topics you'd like to see me cover, feel free to drop them in the comments below. You can also give me a subscription if you want to be notified when the Stelle overview drops when she comes out, if I make a more specialized strategy guide for Dooley, all of that good stuff. But regardless of all that, I hope that whoever you are and wherever you are, you have a wonderful morning, day, evening, or night, and that perhaps I'll see you in the next one.